time.
好，咁咁首先今日開始之前咧，我哋就好多謝 SocREC 啦，咁第二日係幫我哋喺呢個馬年嘅抗爭論壇度幫我哋錄影。咁即係如果大家都想睇翻我哋其他部分嘅片段咧，咁喺 YouTube 度打馬年抗爭論壇咧，都可以 search 到我哋其他嘅部分嗰啲嘅錄影嘅。
So today we welcome everyone back to our forum today, and we also very thankful for SocREC, who will be recording the whole session of the meeting, and it will be available later on YouTube.
咁就因為我哋社會主義行動咧喺美國嘅組織咧，就打入咗呢一個西雅圖嘅市議會啦。呢一個係喺美國嘅左翼嘅運動嘅歷史上一個好重要嘅轉捩點嚟嘅。咁就而亦都係好多年嚟喺美國嘅選舉上咧，有社會主義者係進入到市議會。咁所以呢一個我哋喺美國嘅選舉運動係對於美國全國啦，以至我哋世界上嘅左翼運動咧，都有非常之重要嘅影響。咁所以我哋今日就請到咧喺明尼阿波利斯參選嘅我哋嘅一個成員阿泰摩咧，就會同我哋演講。咁就關於喺佢嘅選舉嘅工程啦，即係我哋選舉上嘅成功啦，同埋對於美國嘅而家個政治嘅局勢咧係有啲分析嘅。
So today we have invited Taimo from Socialist Alternative, which is a sister organization of us in Hong Kong, because it has been we have conducted a very successful campaign in which we have a open socialist candidate who has won in the city council election in USA, which is the first in many years where a socialist is able to win an election in the States. Today we have Taimo, who is also a candidate for Socialist Alternative in Minneapolis, who will be sharing with us the experiences of their election campaign.
咁我哋而家就開始啦。
So you can begin now.
Okay. Well, first I want to thank all of you for coming and listening. I know it's a Sunday morning there. For me, it's 8 p.m. Saturday night still.
咁首先好開心可以即係喺度同大家去進行今日嘅會議啦。咁知道大家即係依家係星期日嘅早上，咁佢嗰邊咧就係星期六嘅晚上8點半嘅啫，8點鐘嘅啫。
And I want to offer greetings from Socialist Alternative in the U.S. to our comrades in the CWI and everyone in attendance today in Hong Kong. We've been following a lot of your struggles of the dock workers, of the students for democracy, which has been tremendously inspiring over the last several years.
咁首先佢即係佢代表住美國呢個社會主義替代，去向即係我哋喺香港嘅工人國際委員會嘅同事同埋支持者啦，去致以呢個致意先啦。咁佢亦都係有留意到我哋喺香港過去呢幾年啦，包括係碼頭工人罷工啦，包括係即係學生反呢個國民教育嘅運動。
Now here in the U.S., the victory of our Socialist Alternative member, Shama Sawant in Seattle, it's really created a new stage for rebuilding a socialist movement here in the U.S.
咁首先佢就係指出咧，即係喺即係西雅圖嘅市議會選舉入邊啦，我哋嘅社會主義者嘅候選人阿 Shama Sawant 啦，即係成功當選啦，就標誌住喺美國嘅社會主義運動咧係進入一個新嘅里程嘅。
Just 6 months ago, even many of the left-wing commentators would have ruled out the possibility of a real revival of socialist politics this year. The only time socialism was typically mentioned in the mainstream media was when right-wingers would call Obama a socialist as a denigrating slur.
咁其實只係講緊短6個月前啦，即係基本上係冇人會預計到今年咧係會即係社會主義係有一個咁大嘅躍進嘅一個狀況嘅。喺當其時，社會主義呢4個字喺主流媒體會出現嘅唯一嘅機會，就係嗰啲 極右嗰啲右派嗰啲政客喺度鬧呢個奧巴馬係一個社會主義者，而當其時佢哋將社會主義咧係當作一個咧貶義鬧人嘅一個詞語嚟嘅。
But just last week, after President Obama delivered his big State of the Union speech, Shama Sawant put a reply on live stream and on YouTube, and nearly 100,000 people have watched it, more than the Republican Party reply to Obama, more than the Tea Party reply to Obama, more than the Green Party's reply to Obama.
咁喺上個禮拜啦，即係奧巴馬總統啦，就係發表咗佢今年嘅國情咨文啦。咁而我哋即係我哋嘅 Shama Sawant 啦，亦都係好快咁樣咧喺YouTube 啦，就係作咗一個直播嘅回應佢嘅國情咨文。咁佢嘅點擊率啦係高達呢個10萬人嘅，咁係高過好多共和黨嘅回應啊、綠黨嘅回應啊，或者茶黨嘅回應嘅。
In Obama's speech, the key issue that he highlighted, and the most popular part of his speech, was when he talked about fighting inequality and raising the minimum wage to $10 an hour, which is what he advocates.
咁喺奧巴馬嘅國情咨文入邊啦，佢嘅主要重點就係關於佢承諾會打擊呢個貧富懸殊嘅問題啦。咁啊並且係提出咧係將呢個美國全國嘅最低工資咧係增加去到10美元1小時嘅。
But everyone knows that Obama will not seriously fight for even this limited increase in workers' wages, and that it will not be achieved this year if it's up to the Democratic Party. He and the Democrats are only raising this demand for a higher minimum wage because he knows it'll help them beat the Republicans in the congressional elections that will happen later this year.
咁但係大家實際上都係知道，其實即係奧巴馬啦，或者係民主黨啦，根本係唔會認真咁樣咧去嘗試去提升工人嘅工資同埋待遇嘅。即係民主黨同埋奧巴馬之所以咁樣講，係因為咧佢哋係知道呢個係佢哋可以唯一用嚟去即係拉票去喺嚟緊嘅國會選舉入邊咧去擊敗共和黨嘅。
Across the country, the Democrats are putting small rises in the minimum wage to $8 to $9 on the ballot in over 35 states across the country.
而喺即係民主黨喺全國各地嘅政綱啦，都實際上只係提出一啲好些微嘅最低工資增長，例如話增加去到8美元，或者增加去到9美元，咁喺全國35個州嗰度去宣傳。
Meanwhile, in Seattle, Shama Sawant and Socialist Alternative are leading the fight for a $15 an hour minimum wage, with building a powerful movement from below to achieve this, which would be the highest in the country.
咁但係喺西雅圖啦、Shama Sawant啦，同埋即係其他嘅積極分子咧，就喺度即係由下而上咧，組織緊一個好強大嘅15蚊最低工資美元嘅運動啦。咁去由下而上咁樣咧，去提出呢個最高嘅最低工資水平。
If we win this demand, and it seems most likely that we will, millions of workers across the country will ask the question, how did they achieve this in Seattle when across the country the union leaders and the Democratic Party can't even achieve $10? How did they achieve 15 in Seattle?
咁依家我哋即係根據我哋目前狀況，我哋好有可能咧可以喺西雅圖咧係贏得15蚊美金最低工資嘅呢個訴求啦。咁一旦我哋能夠成功爭取之後咧，咁美國全國嘅工人咧都會問一個問題，就係點解西雅圖嘅工人能夠贏到15蚊美金，而喺全國其他嘅地方？嗰啲無論係民主黨啊，或者係其他嘅工會領袖啊，連10蚊美金嘅最低工資都爭取唔到咧。
And no one will be able to deny that the unique feature of the struggle in Seattle, what makes it stand apart from all the others, is that it is led by socialists who used a class struggle approach of mobilizing workers from below to force the political establishment to make maximum concessions, instead of the collaborationist, compromising approach that most of the union leaders take to big business, and even the Democratic Party takes to big business.
咁首先即係最重要一點就係西雅圖嘅呢個最低工資嘅運動咧，係相比全國咧係獨一無二嘅。佢係由一個社會主義者透過呢個階級鬥爭嘅分析啦，去領導主呢個運動，由下而上咁樣去組織工人啦，去迫使資方啦同埋財團啦作出最大程度嘅讓步。但係相對而言啦，喺其他即係全國其他地方啦，啲無論係工會嘅領袖啊，或者係民主黨人啦，佢哋都係尋求同財團啊、同老闆去達成妥協同埋讓步。咁所以呢個方式係完全不同嘅。
I think it'd be helpful, however, to step back first from the immediate struggle in Seattle and try and give a political background to how we were able to achieve this and what the conditions in U.S. society that are fueling the growing anger at the ruling class, at the 1%, and even at capitalism.
咁首先我哋就去討論關於即係一啲政治嘅背景先。咁啊，例如話即係我哋點解我哋能夠開始喺西雅圖嘅工作啦？點解即係社會上會出現對於財團啊，對於社會上嗰1%嘅人啊，有咁大嘅怨氣？
We are now 6 years into the worst economic crisis the U.S. has faced since the 1930s. And while there has been a recovery for the rich, most workers have not seen any of the benefits of this recovery.
咁首先即係我哋依家係踏入緊即係美國自30年代以嚟最大嘅一次經濟危機，呢個第6年㗎啦。 咁雖然我哋見到好多人嘅報道都係針對話經濟有復甦，但係呢個只係對於有錢人同埋老闆嘅一個復甦，但係實際上對於普通嘅工人階級嚟講咧，係見唔到任何嘅改變嘅。
90% of the gains of the recovery have gone to just the richest 1%.
而即係所謂呢個復甦啦，入邊90%嘅得益咧，都係去咗社會上邊1%最有錢嗰班人身上。
Official unemployment may be down to around 7%, but in reality, most people acknowledge it's actually more like 15%, and for young people, it's closer to 20%, and for African Americans and Latinos in many cities, it's 25% or more.
咁啊，雖然官方嘅失業率啦係大約喺7%身上啦，但係大部分嘅人咧都認為咧，實際嘅失業率咧係去到15%啦，而如果係年青人嘅失業率咧更加係高達20%。如果係關於即係美國嘅非洲裔啊或者係拉丁裔嘅人咧，喺好多城市入邊咧，佢哋嘅失業率咧係甚至係超過25%嘅。
The jobs that were lost in the economic crisis included many good-paying jobs in manufacturing and technology, but the jobs that have been created have overwhelmingly been low-paid, minimum wage, part-time, precarious jobs that are not enough to support families. We've seen a tremendous growth in poverty as a result.
而社會上所流失嘅好多嘅工種啦，都係一啲即係相對優厚工資啊，一啲技術性嘅工種咧係流失晒啦。反而所謂製造嘅新嘅就業咧，都係一啲廉價、低廉啊、低技術啊，好多係part time 即係兼職工啊，或者係臨時工，甚至係一啲厭惡性嘅工種嚟嘅。
So there's now profound anger in U.S. society against the income inequality, against the inequality between white workers and black workers, where there's work, the conditions are even worse in communities of color. There's anger at the attacks on women, at the attacks on the poor through social programs. The anger is bubbling beneath the surface. Everybody, even the ruling class, acknowledges that.
咁啊，依家實際上即係連統治階級啦都承認啦，依家個社會底層咧係有好大嘅怨氣啦，包括係貧富懸殊嘅不滿啦，包括係對於種族之間工資不平等嘅一個不滿啦，不滿呢個社會去打擊女性工人嘅不滿啦。
many people, the Occupy movement in 2011 gave voice to this anger. And in fact, if you look at the polls, the anger is even broader. The disagreement and the feeling that the government is not doing their job is even broader than it was in 2011. But the problem is the labor leaders, the social movement leaders are refusing to give this anger from below any clear expression.
咁啊，自即係11年嘅佔領華爾街運動開始啦，即係呢種怨氣咧係得到更多人嘅關注啦同埋表達啦。但好可惜嘅就係、即係無論係工會嘅領袖啊，或者係不同即係其他嘅政客啊，都係都拒絕去將呢啲咁嘅怨氣咧整合成為一個有組織同埋清晰嘅力量嘅。
If many of you will remember that in 2008. When Obama was first elected, when the crisis of capitalism in the U.S. first broke, there was tremendous enthusiasm and hopes that Obama would somehow change the direction and challenge the power of Wall Street and big business in the U.S.
咁啊，記得喺08年，即係呢個經濟危機啱啱開始嘅時候，亦都係奧巴馬啱啱新當選嘅時候咧，好多嘅群眾咧係對奧巴馬有好大嘅希望啊，去幻想佢咧係能夠去打破過去嘅壟斷啊，同埋華爾街嘅暴政嘅。
But instead, he completely surrounded himself with Wall Street, former Wall Street executives, with business leaders, and has carried out a thoroughly pro-business agenda that has meant devastation for working people. He's carried out attacks on civil liberties like the NSA spying that I'm sure many of you know about with the revelations of Snowden. And there's tremendous anger and sense of betrayal in U.S. society toward Obama.
但係好遺憾嘅就係奧巴馬反而咧係更加去即係圍繞佢身邊嘅都係一啲即係親資本家啊、親財團啊，好多都係啲前華爾街嘅行政人員啊，甚至喺社會嘅權利即係公共權利方面咧，亦都係爆出咗即係斯諾登關於即係呢個國家安全嘅監控啦。
In 2012, Obama only won re-election because the Republicans were hated even worse. There was no enthusiasm or real illusions.
去到2012年咧，基本上即係民眾已經係即係對於奧巴馬啦係睇清楚佢真面目啦。之所以奧巴馬能夠去勉強連任咧，係因為民眾係更加係不滿呢個共和黨。
And now Obama's approval ratings are the lowest they have ever been. The only reason the Democrats are in deeper trouble is because the Republicans also have the lowest approval rating in recent history. Congress is less popular even than cockroaches in the polls. Less than 10% think like Congress.
咁啊，依家民主黨啦也好，或者係奧巴馬也好啦，佢哋嘅民意咧已經去到即係史上最低點嘅啦。當然，即係民主黨即係唔係去到最差嘅地步，即係未去到一個危機中嘅地步咧，係因為共和黨佢哋嘅民意咧係比佢哋更加低。咁啊，依家講緊甚至係有好即係得10% 嘅人咧係覺得個國會係好嘅啫。
So it's out of this tremendous anger coming up from below, this desire for a political alternative, that socialist alternative was able to gain traction, gain points of support in working class communities who are fed up with the two corporate political parties.
咁正正就係呢個咁嘅政治背景底下咧，群眾係即係好不滿主流嗰兩個政黨，係非常希望咧有新嘅替代啦、新嘅選擇出嚟咧，係取代呢兩個政黨。咁正正就係咁樣咧，即係我哋即係社會主義替代啦，就能夠喺好多工人階級嘅社區啊，喺群眾入邊咧係得到巨大嘅支持同埋吸引力。
But we weren't the only ones to recognize, especially after Occupy, the openings for building working class struggle. A few of the more far-sighted union leaders also saw this, and that's why they started a series of campaigns of low-wage workers at Walmart and at the fast food chains, among other places.
咁我哋係即係少數喺即係佔領華爾街 運動之後咧，係發現咧依家喺美國嘅局勢咧係開始有個機會有個突破口，可以俾我哋喺兩黨制以外咧去進行一個宣傳。咁除咗我哋之外咧，都有一啲工會嘅運動咧，亦都係留意到呢一點啦。咁係開始咗嚟話喺沃爾瑪啊，或者喺呢個快餐店嘅工人運動。
In last year, early at the beginning of 2013, SEIU, one of the biggest unions in the country, organized a series of small one-day strikes of fast food workers, which didn't involve very many workers, but it captured the imagination of millions of people in the U.S.
咁喺2013年啦，即係有個快餐嘅工會啦，咁佢哋喺即係唔同嘅快餐店啦，都係搞咗即係一系列嘅一日罷工。咁每次嘅罷工咧，都唔係話有太多嘅工人參加嘅，但係佢哋呢啲咁嘅一系列嘅行動咧，係吸引咗好多嘅輿論啊、媒體啊同埋工人階級嘅關注嘅。
These small one-day strikes moved from they started in New York, but they moved from city to city to city across the U.S. And most of the people who would come to the demonstrations were not workers, but just were not the fast food workers themselves, but they were other workers who came out because they were so angry at low wages, and they were inspired by the fast food workers standing up for their rights.
咁呢個運動咧，最初喺紐約城開始啊，跟住咧就擴散到去到美國唔同嘅城市啦，去到全國都係咁樣。咁好多時即係喺呢啲咁嘅一日嘅小型嘅罷工入邊啦，即係去支持呢啲快餐店嘅工人嘅抗爭。即係除咗快餐店工人有去到出席之外咧，亦都有好多其他嘅其他職業嘅工人啦去參加，因為佢哋都好不滿佢哋自身。即係呢個人工過低嘅狀況，咁佢哋亦都係咧受到即係快餐店工人嘅行動啦所啟發，亦都係即係去支持佢哋嘅。
One of the main slogans of these strikes was the idea of a $15 an hour wage, which, given that the minimum wage that they were being paid was only $7.25 in most states, this would mean more than doubling of many of their wages. And this very bold demand caught the imagination of millions of workers in the U.S.
咁喺呢啲咁嘅工人運動入邊咧，最核心嘅訴求咧就係$15美金1小時嘅最低工資。因為依家喺美國咧，大部分嘅地區咧都係攞緊7個2毫半美金嘅最低工資嘅啫。咁啊意味住即係依家工人呢啲即係廉價工人嘅訴求咧，就係要將佢哋嘅人工咧差唔多翻1倍咁樣。咁好多工人階級咧都對於佢哋即係咁勇敢嘅運動咧係受到好大嘅啟發嘅。
The union leaders organized these strikes in a very top-down way. They didn't try and give a space for mass involvement of workers, and they never intended to really follow through on their call for 15. It was more of a slogan to try and stir up action, stir up energy. But now, with our intervention, this slogan, Fight for 15, has spun out of their control and is really developing an independent life of its own.
咁啊，過去啦，即係啲工會去組織工人運動啦，都係由上而下咁樣去操控住工人嘅運動啦。佢哋利用即係15蚊最低工資啲口號咧，都係純粹係用嚟煽動支持嘅啫，但係就唔會有實際嘅抗爭去做出。但係去到今日咧，即係呢個15蚊美金嘅運動咧，基本上已經係超出即係工會官僚嘅控制啦，而係發展成為一個獨立啦同埋有自己生命力嘅一個運動㗎啦。
And when Shama Sawant and myself ran for city council in Minneapolis and in Seattle, we decided to take up this slogan that had been popularized by the fast food workers and used it to call for a $15 an hour minimum wage in our cities. And that slogan gained tremendous support when we'd go out into working class communities, knocking on their doors, asking for their vote.
咁我哋即係喺咁樣嘅背景底下啦 ，Shama Sawant 喺西雅圖啦，就係吸取咗15蚊美金嘅呢個口號啦，同埋就喺即係 自己即係西雅圖嘅工人階級嘅社區啦，去組織運動啦，同埋宣傳咁樣係贏得好大嘅群眾支持嘅。
In Seattle, we ran under the slogan, Make Seattle Affordable for All. We put forward $15 hour minimum wage, taxing the rich and big business to fund education and public transit, and the idea of affordable housing for all.
咁啊喺西雅圖啦，我哋嘅口號咧就係話，即係讓西雅圖變成一個人人都付得起、人人都負擔得起嘅一個城市。咁我哋嘅口號包括就係15美金嘅最低工資啦，包括係向有錢人去徵稅，去負擔我哋嘅公眾嘅交通啦、公眾嘅教育啦、公眾嘅社會福利嘅。
And Seattle is seen as is a very rich city, but it was also the city where the price of rent rose the fastest in the U.S. in the last year. It's also a very expensive place to live, and so this idea that Seattle should be, that the riches of Seattle, the huge wealth of companies like Microsoft, of Boeing, of Amazon, that the riches should be shared out amongst everyone to make Seattle affordable for all. This idea really caught hold.
即係雖然話西雅圖係一個好有錢嘅城市啊，但係實際上嚟話佢嘅租金啊、佢嘅物價、佢嘅生活嘅費用咧都係好高昂嘅。咁所以我哋嘅立場就係提出話要求將即係喺西雅圖嘅一啲大財團啦，佢哋嗰啲累積嗰啲大量嘅利潤啦，係應該係用嚟俾整個社會咧係得以負擔得起嘅，包括係例如話微軟嘅公司啊，包括例如話亞馬遜公司啊，定係波音公司都係。
And our organization, Socialist Alternative, was unique on the U.S. left. Most others, they were excited about the fast food strike, they agreed with the $15 an hour slogan, but nobody else saw the possibility of a bold socialist campaign that championed these slogans of really being able to win mass support. We saw that perspective, which is why we ran very aggressive, very energetic election campaigns.
咁即係我哋社會主義替代喺美國嘅左翼群體入邊咧係好即係獨特嘅，即係其他嘅左翼咧冇人能夠即係覺得話可以有機會，即係因為呢個15最低工資嘅運動咧，係可以有呢個機會咧，去即係大力去做，即係喺即係社會主義運動嘅宣傳。咁但係我哋咧就察覺到呢個咁嘅突破口，咁所以我哋咧就係進行咗即係西雅圖同埋喺其他地方嘅選舉嘅，即係參選嘅。
We understood that while a majority of workers in Seattle were angry at big business, angry at low wages, angry at inequality, and many of them even saw capitalism as the problem, we knew that we had to translate the ideas of socialism into a language that many workers would be able to understand.
即係雖然話，即係好多嘅群眾啦，對於依家嘅社會矛盾啊，對於依家嘅工資低啊，對於財團嘅不滿啦，係非常之憤怒啦。咁但係即係甚至有啲人係會覺得資本主義係出咗問題嘅。咁但係我哋都係需要咧，需要諗辦法咧，係點樣將社會主義咧去翻譯成為工人階級普遍能夠明白同埋聽得明嘅言語嘅。
We explained that both political parties were dominated by big business, and that the Democrats who were in charge in both Seattle and in Minneapolis, that the Democratic Party would never seriously fight for working people because of its ties to big business.
而我哋就強調啦，就係現時兩個政黨啦，無論係民主共和兩黨，佢哋其實都係同財團有千絲萬縷嘅關係。無論係明尼亞波利斯啊，定係喺西雅圖啦，佢哋嘅民主黨人啦，都係因此而唔會咧認真咁樣啦，去對抗財團嘅利益嘅。
And so that the only way that working people would be able to achieve things like a living wage at their work, or achieve things like affordable housing, the only way we'd see taxes on the rich raised enough to provide adequate public transit and public education and other services was to break from the Democratic Party, for the unions, for the social movements, to unify together in an independent political force that was prepared to challenge big business and challenge capitalism for power.
正係因為咁啦，所以我哋就要向工人階級去解釋，就話如果大家想要爭取一個合理嘅生活工資啊，爭取一個廉價嘅房屋啊，要求向即係財團去徵稅，去負擔我哋社會嘅交通、社會嘅教育等等嘅話咧，就係需要工人階級係需要建立一個獨立於民主黨嘅社會運動，工會亦都係需要脫離民主黨嘅關聯嘅。
In this way, we were able to win over in Seattle. We won over 90,000 votes for an openly socialist candidate, which is the biggest vote that a socialist has received in the U.S. in many, many decades.
咁所以我哋今次喺西雅圖嘅選舉入邊咧，我哋即係雖然我哋係公開嘅社會主義者，但係我哋都贏到9萬嘅選票。呢個係講緊美國幾十年嚟咧，第一次有即係一個公開嘅社會主義者能夠贏到咁多選票。
But I think it's also important to understand we also won the support of many people who do not consider themselves socialists. Even many of the forces who've traditionally allied themselves with the Democratic Party and who've not thoroughly broken, even though they ended up supporting us during this election campaign. And it's important to understand why.
咁啊，但係另外有一點咧，就係值得留意，就係咧，即係喺好多支持我哋嘅人當中啦，其實佢哋未必係自然認為係一個社會主義者咧，或者佢哋都未完全咧去斬斷佢哋同民主黨嘅關係嘅，但係佢哋依然都係今次嘅選舉入邊咧去支持我哋嘅候選人，咁亦都係值得去研究點解嘅。
Just to give one example, the most important trade union in Minneapolis or in Minnesota, SEIU, they endorsed our campaign at the same time as they endorsed other Democrats for mayor and for other positions on city council. So on the one hand, they were prepared to support a socialist in my race, even while they supported the Democratic Party in other races.
用緊即係一個例子咧，就係喺明尼亞波利斯其中一個最重要嘅工會咧 SCIU 啦，咁佢哋係支持泰莫嘅選舉嘅，但係喺其他嘅即係議席嘅競選上面咧。例如話係選市長啊，或者其他市議員嘅位置嘅時候咧，佢哋亦都係有支持其他嘅民主黨人嘅喎，即係話佢哋一方面係支持泰莫社會主義替代啦，另一方面亦都喺其他嘅競選上面咧係支持民主黨人嘅。
The union leaders did this for two reasons. On the one hand, they felt pressure from below. There were more of their rank and file members who volunteered energetically for our campaign than for any of the other campaigns across the city.
咁啊，工會之所以咁做有兩大原因啦。第一大原因就係佢哋感受到即係佢哋嘅工人會員啦，由下而上嘅壓力，即係包括係佢哋好多嘅成員啦，係會即係自己去支持即係社會主義替代嘅選舉運動啊，去作為呢個義工啊等等嘅。
But on the other hand, the union leaders wanted to see a socialist on city council because they've become very frustrated with the Democratic Party, who they throw millions of dollars at, they threw tons of volunteer hours at, and yet again and again are betrayed.
而另一方面，另一個原因就係呢啲工會領導佢哋自身啊，都開始對於民主黨咧係感到失望，因為佢哋過去咧即係曾經係花費咗好多嘅錢啦，去捐助俾啲民主黨人啦，但係佢哋一次又一次咧感受到民主黨人嘅背叛嘅。
So to have Shama Sawant on city council in Seattle, or to have myself if I had won, which I came very close to doing. For some of them, they would see us as leverage to try and pressurize the Democratic Party rather than trying to break from the Democratic Party, which is what we advocate.
咁所以佢哋支持 Shama Sawant 去進入市議會，或者佢哋支持 Tai 去進入市議會，即係 Tai 都係差啲都可以入到市議會㗎啦。咁佢哋將即係我哋社會主義者能夠進入社會主義能夠進入市議會嘅呢個支持咧，係視作一個佢哋能夠同民主黨人咧去制衡民主黨人嘅一個工具咁樣，即係話佢哋咧唔係完全否定民主黨人，但係佢哋想要有我哋咧去向民主黨咧有更大嘅施壓咁樣。
I was going to say more about how we won in Seattle, but for lack of time, I'll just summarize a few points. We had over 400 volunteers that came out onto the streets. We raised over $140,000 from ordinary working class people, which is more than probably an openly revolutionary socialist has raised in the U.S. in any election in history.
咁啊，即係冇辦法啦，去好即係詳細地講啦，即係我哋點樣即係逐步去贏咗西雅圖呢個市議會嘅議席翻嚟啦。但係首先即係好簡單，就係話我哋有大約400個義工啦，我哋喺工人階級群體入邊咧，我哋係籌到即係14萬美金嘅錢啦。咁呢個係即係甚至係比民主黨啊，或者係好多嘅即係其他嘅候選人咧係籌到更多嘅錢嘅。
But I think the most exciting work actually is not the election victory, but it's what we've been able to achieve in the months after the election victory, in particular in the fight for 15 in Seattle, which is ongoing.
咁啊，除咗我哋話係我哋能夠勝選之外咧，即係更加能夠值得鼓舞就係我哋勝選之後，我哋能夠去贏得啲乜嘢，包括係講緊我哋15蚊最低工資個運動上邊。
To begin with, it's just important to note the mass media attention that Shama Sawant has been able to receive since her election victory, and the media attention keeps growing week by week by week.
咁首先就係即係因為 Shama Sawant 咧，佢係贏勝選之後咧，佢所獲得嘅媒體同埋輿論嘅關注，呢個關注咧係即係日益上升嘅添。
In Seattle itself, she's on the front page of the main newspapers and on TV news every few nights, sometimes twice a week, which is previously unheard of for any representative of the socialist movement in the U.S.
咁尤其是喺西雅圖市入邊啦，即係Shama Sawant係基本上每隔幾日咧就會喺電視啊或者係報紙頭版度出現啦。咁啊，甚至係一個禮拜可以出現2次咁樣。咁所以呢個係過去咧其他社會主義社會主義者咧都係冇辦法去做到嘅。
She's been our organization, Socialist Alternative, and Shama Sawant have had articles in the New York Times, the LA Times, national television news like MSNBC, Fox News. All of the liberal and progressive and left-wing media have covered her many, many times.
咁我哋即係亦都係喺全國嘅好多媒體度係被報導啦，例如話係紐約時報啊，例如話美國全國電視台 MSNBC 啊，或者係呢個右翼嘅 Fox News 啊。咁啊，除此之外，當然啦，即係左傾啲嘅或者比較進步啲嘅媒體，當然亦都係更大地去報導佢啦。
And maybe if you don't live in the U.S., the significance of this isn't clear enough. But of course, as I said before, previous to this, for the last decade or more, we saw no real representatives of the socialist movement. The only time socialism was talked about in the mainstream media was when the right wing would attack us.
即係如果你唔係住喺身處喺美國嘅話，可能你感受唔到呢個嘅改變有啲咩咁重要。但係即係可以同大家咁講啦，即係過去呢10幾年間啦，過去即係喺美國咧，社會主義咧係冇一個凝聚到嘅代表出到嚟嘅喎。即係過去即係你喺主流媒體見到社會主義呢4隻字出現嘅時候，就係啲右翼共和黨人咧去用嚟抹黑奧巴馬嘅時候。
And it's been tremendously inspiring for left-wing workers, for activists across the country to see someone who really speaks their language, who is really fighting back against big business and the 1%, who's principled, who will only take the average wage of the workers they represent.
咁所以今次嘅呢個勝選咧係即係啟發咗同埋激勵咗好多左翼嘅工人啊，好多嘅積極運動嘅積極分子啊。
At the inauguration, when all the city councilors and the new mayor of Seattle was sworn in at what is normally a very formal ceremony, Shama Sawant and our supporters turned it into a rally for the fight for 15, transforming the whole thing.
咁啊，而喺即係勝選之後啦，就有呢個市議會啊，同埋新任市長嘅就職典禮啦。咁啊，過去呢咁嘅就職典禮都係好官方形式化嘅一個活動嚟嘅。但係我哋今次3一數安啦，係能夠好成功啦，同埋即係佢同埋佢嘅支持者咧，係將今次呢個就職典禮咧，係轉變成為一個去捍衞15美金嘅呢個抗爭運動咁樣。
Instead of what typically happens of just a couple hundred people in suits and ties, the ruling class showing up and clapping for their new mayor, instead there was 1,000 people there, many of them in red t-shirts or red signs for 15 now, cheering and shouting for Shama Sawant. So we completely stole the show from the ruling establishment in Seattle.
過去呢啲就職典禮咪可能係百零人，全部打晒呔、着晒西裝咁樣，尤其是嗰啲統治精英咧，就喺度咧為佢哋嘅新任市長啊、市議員咧去拍手咁樣。但係今次咧，我哋呢個咁嘅就職典禮有超過1000人參加，好多我哋嘅支持者咧着晒紅衫，舉晒紅牌，咁樣咧去熱烈咁去歡呼，即係Shama Sawant嘅發言咁樣。
1 week later, we had in early January, we had the founding meeting of 15 Now, which is a broad organization launched by Shama Sawant Socialist Alternative to fight for a $15 an hour minimum wage. And 500 people showed up for an enthusiastic 2-hour-long rally to fight low-wage workers and activists.
咁我哋亦都係成立咗一個叫做立即15蚊嘅呢個咁樣嘅即係可爭取15美金嘅一個廣泛嘅抗爭運動啦。咁啊，呢個成立嘅大會上面有500人參加，即係呢個成2個鐘頭嘅集會咁樣，亦都係好即係好見到好多好積極嘅人嘅。
And then 1 week after that, we organized a mass rally on the traditional Martin Luther King Day in Seattle, which is normally just a few hundred people. Well, this year it was 5,000 people, and it was completely dominated by Fight for 15 signs.
咁啊，1個禮拜之後咧，我哋都參加咗呢個馬丁路德金日嘅集會啦。咁啊，過去即係每年嘅馬丁路德金集會咧，都係可能講緊幾百人嘅啫。但係我哋今次咧就有5000人參加啦，並且係好多人咧都係舉住即係要求15蚊嘅呢個牌嘅。
Now the mayor of Seattle, who represents big business, has been forced under the pressure of workers to say that he's in favor of $15 an hour minimum wage.
咁啊，甚至係逼使呢個本身係親財團嘅市長啦，佢都係因為受到佢嘅市民嘅壓力啦，而係咧去被迫開腔去講話佢支持15美金嘅呢個訴求嘅。
But he said that he's in favor of 15, but he doesn't think it should start until several years from now. And he wants to write in exemptions for all manner of different businesses in Seattle to really try and cut it away and water it down as much as possible.
但係雖然佢話佢支持15蚊最低工資喎，但係佢話咧佢唔認為要即刻實行，佢話咧要慢慢喺幾年後咧先係去搞，同埋咧佢亦都要考慮咧又有咩行業啊，有咩工種咧係可以被剔除喺呢個限制以外嘅，咁啊即係變相咧去諗緊唔同嘅方法啦，去即係解除呢個15美金最低工資呢個政策嘅。
And we point out that the mayor never even talked about $15 an hour until Shama Sawant and the fast food workers began protesting and raising this demand on the city.
我哋都係強調嘅，即係我哋揭露咗原來呢個市長咧喺即係有快餐工人啊，或者喺Shama Sawant嘅運動之前咧，佢根本連提都冇提過15蚊最低工資嘅議題嘅。
The mayor has now set up this living wage committee, and he's invited all the main business leaders as well as all the main labor leaders onto this committee. And Shama Sawant also agreed to sit on this committee.
咁啊，依家個市長咧就成立咗一個叫做生活工資嘅委員會啦。咁啊，所謂研究呢個 工資嘅問題啦。咁佢就邀請咗好多商家嘅代表啊，亦都係邀請咗其他嗰啲勞工代表咧，即係包括係Shama Sawant啦，去喺呢個委員會入邊嘅。
But we've made very clear, Shama Sawant made very clear, that unless this committee comes out with a clear proposal for $15 an hour that the working people of Seattle can accept by the end of April, that we're prepared to take the issue directly to the voters.
咁啊，Shama Sawant 但係即係雖然加入咗呢個委員會啦，但係亦都好清楚去強調就話，即係除非呢個委員會係好清晰去提出$15嘅呢個proposal 嘅話咧，咁佢準備喺4月嘅時候咧，就會將呢個議題咧交俾工人階級去決定嘅。
Because there's two legal ways that a $15 an hour minimum wage can be achieved. Either the mayor and the city council can pass an ordinance to enact a minimum wage, or if we collect enough signatures, we can put it on the ballot for the voters to decide the question in November.
咁啊，基本上咧，現行法例上邊咧有兩種方式咧係可以實現15蚊最低工資嘅法案啦。咁第一方法就係由市長啦同埋市議會啦去提出同埋通過，即係15蚊最低工資嘅一個法案咁樣。咁第二個方法咧就係如果我哋能夠湊夠足夠嘅市民嘅簽署嘅話咧，我哋可以啟動呢個公投嘅程序，喺11月嘅時候咧，由即係去投票去決定應唔應該有15蚊最低工資嘅。
Either way, we explained that it's not going to be enough for Shama and Socialist Alternative to build this, that it's going to take a mass movement from below to be able to pressure city council enough, or to be able to fight the big business propaganda campaign that will inevitably come if it goes to a vote in November.
咁但係無論係邊種方法都好啦，即係我哋社會主義替代都係強調就話咧。單靠即係議會或者單靠公投咧係不足夠嘅，即係我哋要想實現15蚊最低工資咧，我哋面對嘅就係要即係例如話點樣逼使呢個市會即係向佢哋施壓啦，或者點樣去應對財團方面嘅抹黑啊同埋宣傳嘅機器。咁呢啲咧都係需要咧去更加去進一步發展群眾嘅運動咧，由下而上去組織工人階級去抗爭嘅。
And we anticipate that if we try and bring it to the ballot, that big business, not just in Seattle, but nationally, will spend, $10, $20, $30 million. We don't know how much, but a tremendous amount of money in a propaganda and misinformation campaign saying that raising minimum wage will destroy jobs, destroy the economy, all the usual right-wing corporate propaganda against workers' demands.
而我哋預計，如果我哋真係即係去啟動呢個公投嘅程序嘅話咧，咁啊，即係唔單止係西雅圖嘅資本家會開始抹黑同埋宣傳啦，我相信係全國嘅資本家同埋財團啦，會花數以千萬計美金去搞佢哋抹黑嘅宣傳嘅運動，包括就係都係用翻佢哋慣常嘅例子啦，例如話增加最低工資會破壞工業工作啊，會破壞經濟啊，會搞到啲人會失業啊等等嘅呢啲抹黑宣傳嘅。
And we know what's really behind their efforts is because they stand to lose millions in profits every year. If McDonald's has to pay its workers $15 instead of $8 an hour in Seattle, it both will hurt their profits in Seattle, but a bigger danger for them is that the idea will spread and that workers across the country will look to Seattle as a model and begin trying to fight for a rise in their wages as well.
而即係全國嘅資本家都會好關注呢個議題，係因為即係唔係淨係西雅圖，就算我係淨係西雅圖有15蚊最低工資，都會影響到全國嘅工人階級，因為會受到啟發同埋去即係更多嘅工人喺全國其他地方係引起更多嘅工人嘅抗爭，咁呢嘢會影響到即係資本家嘅巨額利潤嘅。
And we're not naive. We know that if we can get our ideas out, if we can answer the big business propaganda, that we could win popular support for raising the minimum wage to 15. But that big business has far greater tools to and a less politically conscious one.
Sorry, can you repeat the last sentence because we missed that?
Yeah. Big business will spend millions spreading lies and confusion, but we know we can answer that, but it'll take resources to be able to reach all the workers in Seattle with our message.
即係我哋明白到我哋有足夠嘅理論同埋論述去回應呢啲咁嘅即係財團方面嘅抹黑同埋即係宣傳啦。咁但係我哋要真係將呢啲咁嘅信息直達去到工人階級身上嘅話，我哋就需要更多嘅資源要去喺宣傳上面去進行鬥爭嘅。
And socialist alternative alone, even with the support we have in the working class communities, won't be able to have a big enough apparatus, enough money to answer the big business propaganda, which is why we need to win over the labor leaders and the other leaders of the big organizations to force them to join us in this fight.
而我哋單靠即係社會主義替代，或者單靠我哋喺西雅圖市入邊嘅支持者，根本就唔具備足夠嘅資源同埋宣傳嘅工具喺全國上面去進行反宣傳㗎嘛。咁所以我哋明白我哋需要贏得更多嘅積極分子嘅支持，包括係好多嘅工會領導去支持我哋呢一個嘅抗爭嘅。
And so far we've been tremendously successful. The organization we started, 15 Now, has the endorsement of virtually every union in Seattle, of the organizations of the different immigrant communities, of the environmental groups. Right now, we have everybody lined up behind our initiatives and joining us in our calls for action, and etc.
暫時我哋即係去到目前為止，我哋嘅15蚊立即15蚊嘅呢個運動咧係好成功啦！即係基本上好多唔同嘅團體啊、組織啊、環保嘅團體啊，或者係工會嘅組織咧，都喺西雅圖入邊咧都係支持即係我哋呢個同埋加入呢個咁嘅抗爭平台嘅。
But at the same time, the mayor has set up this committee that I described earlier that has the business leaders alongside the labor leaders. And he's going to use that committee to try and convince the labor leaders to accept a very watered down proposal for less than 15, or maybe just 15 phased in over many years.
咁啊，但係即係同時間咧，即係個市長啦，即係成立嗰個委員會度啦，係邀請咗即係商家代表同埋工會嘅代表啦。咁亦都係即係佢亦都係企圖咧，將利用呢個委員會啦，入邊嘅商家代表啦，係即係叫做向嗰啲工會代表去施壓啦，要求佢哋去接受一個可能係低於15蚊嘅最低工資，或者係一個拖延喺未來。好多年之後先至可能會落實到嘅15蚊嘅計劃咯。
So our entire approach is to take the movement, to take the initiative out of the hands of the more conservative labor leaders, out of the hands of the conservative Democrats, out of the hands of the mayor, and to put it into the hands of working class people in the communities, at the grassroots level, in the workplace. Which is why we're calling for the establishment of neighborhood committees across Seattle to take a lead in initiating this movement.
咁所以我哋明白到啦，我哋需要將呢個15蚊美金嘅運動啦，從呢啲嘅保守嘅民主黨人啊、保守嘅工會代表、工會領袖咧，佢哋身上咧去攞開，跟住將呢個議題咧擺翻入去工人嘅社區去到決定嘅，包括即係我哋咧去成立好多呢啲咁嘅即係社區即係鄰舍嘅委員會啦。
We're next weekend on February 15th. We're calling for a mass organizing meeting where we invited workers and activists and young people across Seattle to come together to do trainings, how to form neighborhood committees, how to go out and collect signatures, how to win over your neighborhood leaders, and how to build a mass movement from below to put pressure on the city leaders and on big business to accept our demands.
咁我哋嚟緊啦，下個禮拜15號啦，就會喺即係搞咗個即係大型嘅組織會議啦。咁就邀請咗唔同社區嘅工人啊、組織啊、工會啊代表咧去參加，咁啊 去討論關於點樣喺即係地區度咧成立即係社區嘅委員會啦，點樣去做地區嘅宣傳啦，點樣收集聯署啦，點樣去做宣傳回應一啲財團啊嘅抹黑咁樣嘅。
And we're going to be building for a week of action in March, followed by a mass meeting at the end of April, which, as I said, was the deadline that Shama Sawant gave the mayor to come up with his proposal, the end of April. So we'll have a mass meeting at the end of April. We're aiming to get over 1,000 people there to decide the question: do we accept the mayor's proposal, or do we take it to the ballot for the voters?
咁我哋亦都喺3月啦，會有一個為期1個禮拜嘅宣傳行動啦。咁我哋去到4月啦，就會係即係之前 Shama Sawant 啦，佢向政府啦定出嘅一個死期嘅，就係即係講即係話政府交唔交到一個15蚊美金嘅死線咁樣。咁我哋會喺4月尾咧就會去號召一個即係超過1000人參加嘅大型集會啦，去決定大家會唔會去接受呢一個方案。即係如果唔接受嘅話咧，我哋就會去即刻去咧啟動呢個公投嘅程序㗎啦。
And again, the idea of this mass meeting is to put pressure on the labor leaders, the union leaders, to take the decision out of their hands whether to accept the mayor's proposal or not, and to put it into the hands of the workers and the communities, and to put pressure on them not to sell out, not to compromise, but to stay with the needs and the demands of the people, to stay with the movement, to fight for everything we can possibly get.
咁我哋搞呢啲咁嘅大型嘅集會嘅目的咧，就係要向呢啲咁嘅工人即係工會領導啦，去施壓啦，即係逼佢哋咧睇到即係個群眾嘅運動啦，並且係唔會向嗰啲財團去出賣群眾運動嘅。
So of course we can't predict exactly what the outcome in Seattle. That will be decided by how strong a movement we can build and how strong big business is in resisting. But what I think the clearest perspective is that one way or the other, the most likely outcome is we'll win the highest minimum wage in the country in Seattle this year. It may not be 15, but it'll be higher than anywhere else. And that will be a huge victory and a testament to the power of socialist ideas and the power of working class struggle.
即係我哋冇辦法去完全咁樣去預言，即係個最後嘅結果係點嘅樣。但係我哋相信咧，即係我哋即係呢個運動，即係呢個亦都會取決於我哋能夠動員幾多個，我哋嘅動員嘅力量有幾大啊，同埋即係資本家嘅反抗有幾頑固啦。咁但係無論如何啦，我哋相信咧，最終我哋能夠喺西雅圖市入邊啦，去爭取到一個全國水平咧最高嘅一個最低工資。即係就算佢唔係15蚊美金，但係佢個最低工資相信亦都會係即係全國水平咧係最高嘅。咁呢個亦都會係鼓舞住其他即係全國其他地區嘅工人啦，亦都係證明咗即係一個社會主義嘅工人運動佢嘅潛在力量有幾大嘅。
And as I said near the beginning of my talk, a victory in Seattle on this question on the minimum wage will have huge reverberations across the U.S. because the fight against inequality, the issue of raising the minimum wage, this is going to be the dominant issue in the U.S. politics for the coming year. Even the Democrats have had to accept that a small increase in the minimum wage is necessary in most states across the U.S.
咁亦都係正如我開頭所講啦，15蚊美金呢個運動咧，將會係一個好具即係將會有好大嘅全國迴響嘅。即係就算講緊民主黨人咧，佢哋亦都係承認咧，即係呢個依家現時最低工資嘅水平咧係太低，係需要有個調整咁樣。咁我哋一旦能夠喺呢個運動上面去成功嘅話咧，將會咧係有好大嘅可能嘅。
But working people are not stupid. They're going to look around the country and they're going to see how did they achieve the highest minimum wage in Seattle when everywhere else, when the movement was led by the Democratic Party or by the conservative trade union leaders, we only got $8, $9, at best $10. How did they achieve the highest minimum wage? Maybe if it's 15, how did they achieve 15 in Seattle? Well, it's because the socialists led that campaign and they used a class struggle approach.
15 minutes left。咁 咁即係我哋一旦能夠喺西雅圖去贏得呢個全國最高水平嘅最低工資之後，咁全國嘅工人階級佢唔係蠢㗎嘛，佢都會問呢個問題：點解西雅圖嘅工人能夠贏到一個咁高水平嘅最低工資，但係佢嘅地方嘅最低工資運動由呢啲民主黨人去領導或者係由呢啲保守嘅工會領袖去帶領住最終可能得個8蚊9蚊嘅水平，完全係唔足夠嘅。咁佢哋就會開始去研究同埋學習西雅圖嘅抗爭模式啦。咁我哋喺西雅圖嘅抗爭模式就一個好清晰嘅社會主義一個階級鬥爭組織由下而上嘅工人運動嘅抗爭模式嚟嘅。
In our organization, Socialist Alternative, we draw an analogy to a very important and very famous strike that in my city, Minneapolis, in 1934. And this year is the 80th anniversary of the famous Teamster strike of 1934, led by the Trotskyists in the U.S. at the time.
而我哋今年亦都係即係一個喺明尼亞波利斯一個由托洛即係當其時托派所領導一個好偉大嘅一場罷工嘅80週年紀念啦。
And that strike in Minneapolis in 1934 was significant because it was the beginning of the resurgence of a mass labor movement in the U.S. and the beginning of a resurgence of socialist organizing in the U.S. in the 1930s.
咁嗰次嘅罷工係好重要啦，因為嗰次嘅罷工係標誌住咧美國喺30年代咧工人運動社會主義運動一個復興嘅一個狀況嚟嘅。
Before 1934, there were many strikes, many demonstrations of the unemployed, but because they were led by the conservative union leaders who refused to break the law, who refused to defend workers, who allowed the scabs in, all the strikes, or the vast majority of the strikes before 1934, ended in terrible defeat.
咁喺1934年之前美國都有好多嘅罷工或者工人嘅抗爭運動，去反對啲失業或者員工低嘅問題啦。咁但係當其時啲運動都係由一啲保守嘅工會領袖去帶領住，佢哋拒絕話去抗命違反法律或者佢哋拒絕去支持工人階級嘅運動啦，變相就係令到1934年之前嘅工人運動往往係失敗收場嘅。
But in Minneapolis, the Teamsters Union had a socialist leadership, which meant that they were not prepared to accept the anti-union laws. They broke the laws, they shut the city down, and they demanded a doubling of their wages. And through a series of strikes and confrontations in which both police and workers were killed, the militant trade union leaders that were running a very democratic union, they prevailed and won one of the biggest victories of the early 1930s.
咁但係1934年嘅運動入邊係由個工會係由社會主義者去帶領啦，咁即係代表住佢哋根本就係唔會承認同埋接受當其時啲反工會嘅法律咁樣。咁當其時佢係帶領住工人去進行咗好多場嘅具戰鬥性啦，甚至係有工人同埋警察有傷亡嘅對壘啦。咁最終佢哋能夠去達到佢哋嘅目標，即係佢哋係成功爭取佢哋人工係翻倍嘅。
And workers across the country, they studied what happened in Minneapolis, the methods that were used to win, and other similar strikes led by socialists that same year across the country. And that led to a mass resurgence both of the socialist movement in the U.S., but even more important, of a mass growth of the labor movement that within a few years had completely transformed the landscape for U.S. workers across the country. It was the beginning of a new era in the U.S.
咁正就係因為3、4年嘅運動嘅成功啦，令到唔單止係明尼亞波利斯嘅工人成功之外咧，其他全國嘅工人咧，亦都係爭相去學習明尼亞波利斯嘅工人運動啦。並且係導致咗咧30年代咧工人運動，即係喺美國嘅工人運動嘅復興啦，同埋即係工會運動嘅強化啦，亦都係咧即係改變咗。即係30年代打後咧，美國嘅國內嘅社會嘅政治版圖嘅。
And this story is very well known amongst, at least amongst Trotskyists and socialists in the U.S. today, which maybe is not a lot of people. But for our organization, we say that Seattle 2014 is, we want to make that like Minneapolis 1934. That if we can win a historic victory for working people led by socialists in Seattle this year, that can have a transformative effect both for the socialist movement and the wider workers' movement in the U.S. in the years ahead.
咁我哋嘅目標就係將2014年嘅西雅圖變成1934年嘅明尼亞波利斯。如果我哋能夠喺今年喺即係工人運動入邊有一個重大嘅突破同埋勝利之後咧，呢個將會係影響到美國全國其他地方今後一段好長嘅時間嘅工人階級運動嘅一個復興同埋進化嘅。
So again, I want to thank the comrades in Hong Kong and all of you for listening to the story of what we're doing here in the U.S. I think these kinds of international exchanges are crucial to learn lessons from around the world to advance all of our struggles, because in the end, the working class of the world must unite and fight to overthrow capitalism and build a socialist world where all of our needs can be met. So thanks again.
咁最後亦都再一次多謝喺香港嘅同志同埋支持者咧，今日參與我哋嘅呢個分享同埋討論啦，亦都係呢啲咁嘅國際性嘅交流咧係非常之重要嘅，因為呢個係可以咧互相學習咧應用喺各自地區嘅抗爭啦。即係畢竟我哋都係講緊強調咧，就係工人階級咧應該全世界就係團結起嚟啦，共同去反對呢個推翻呢個資本主義制度啦，去建立一個民主嘅社會主義制度嘅。係啦，
俾掌聲先。好，咁而家我哋就即刻去到係提問啦，或者係大家發表意見嘅環節。咁我哋大概40分鐘左右嘅。
We have 40 minutes of Q&A and comment.
咁大家如果有問題咧，咁就可能會問2至3條問題咧，咁阿泰就會係答一次。咁然後睇下最後一個時間，然後再做一個總結咁樣。
So we can collect 2 or 3 questions or comments, and then Taiken has a response, and then we can collect more comments and questions.
Great.
係咁係啦，即係我哋見到嗰個即係喺美國啦，咁係嗰個兩黨制裏面啦，咁好似頭先都提到係即係民主黨同埋呢一個共和黨，咁佢哋嘅政策都係好即係類近啦，即係都係財團嘅代表咁啦，咁即係嘅個政策咁都係即係喺經濟上係打壓住即係普通嘅群眾啦，即係工人階級啦，咁亦都係即係即係我哋所做嘅工作啦，即係其實喺香港呢一度都會係有一個啟發啦。咁啊喺呢一度，即係無論係即係建制派嘅政黨，即係又或者係即係普遍嘅即係泛民嘅其他政黨啊，咁佢哋其實喺即係嘅經濟嘅政策裏邊啦，其實都係好傾向財團啦，即係反對。即係好似即係民主黨啊，咁等等其他嘅一開始係贊成領匯上市啊，即係或者係唔贊同最低工資啊，即係呢一啲咁等等嘅經濟嘅，即係傾向財團嘅經濟立場啦。咁所以即係喺我哋呢一度都係即係同美國嘅抗爭係一樣啦，即係要即係俾群眾去提供另一個嘅選擇啦，即係一個嘅工人嘅政黨嘅選擇啦。咁亦即係要去，即係我哋嘅政治代表啦，而係攞住我哋工人嘅，即係同其他嘅工人嘅一樣嘅工資啊，即係而且係要由 普通嘅即係基層嘅工人啦，同埋群眾一齊係去到參與啦，去建立㗎啦，係有一個即係嘅不斷嘅政治討論啦，而係令到每一個嘅成員都係有一個嘅政治意識啦，即係去到避免好似即係其他嘅可能係工會啊，或者係即係政黨啊，係因為佢哋嘅成員嘅即係嘅參與嘅意識嘅缺乏啦，即係而係令到官僚嘅出現啦。咁而係亦都係要喺即係要去將一啲即係包括係最低工資啊咁等等經濟訴求聯繫到政治嘅抗爭啦。咁我係講到。
So what he said is looking at the experiences of the two-party system in the United States, we see there are two mainstream parties who are equally pro-business and equally anti-working class. It is basically the same situation in Hong Kong, where we see the pro-establishment camp on one side and the bourgeois opposition on the other side are equally pro-business, and for instance they support privatization or they both attack a living wage of the working class. So it shows that in Hong Kong we also have we also need to build a working class alternative in which, for instance, like Sharma Sawant, our representatives should live on a working wage. We need to build an alternative, a new model of working class organizations with grassroots democracy, where every working class are given the maximum opportunity to democratically discuss and decide on issues to prevent the rise of bureaucracy, and then to turn economic struggles into political struggles.
台湾在10年前也有争取那个最低工资的运动，然后是由学生发起的。那最后虽然因为有一些政治上的一些当时情况，所以成功了，但是因为没有在工人里面有是一个工人的群众运动，所以到现在其实在工人里面对这个议题还是不太熟悉。那我想请教就是美国同志他们在组织这个像是15美元运动的时候，他们是怎么像他们那边的移工，他们是怎么组织，然后他们对这个议题的看法是什么？
翻譯咗廣東話先。
咁佢話咧，台灣10年前咧都有一啲爭取設立最低工資嘅運動嘅，但係呢啲運動咧嗰陣時就係由學生去到發起，咁亦都正因為係咁啦，所以令到好多工人其實都對於呢一個台灣嘅最低工資嘅爭取嘅運動咧並唔係非常之熟悉嘅，咁所以佢就想問美國嘅同志喺組織呢啲運動嘅時候，係點樣向呢一啲特別係點樣向啲義工解釋呢個運動嘅意義咧，同埋點樣能夠組織你啲義工將呢一個最低工資嘅運動即係解釋清楚咧
？It is a question from a Taiwanese comrade. He tells us that 10 years ago there was a struggle for minimum wage in Taiwan, but it was mainly led by the students. And there were very little working class participation in the movement. And because of this, despite there is they achieved the minimum wage at that time, up till now, the issue of minimum wage is not widespread amongst the working class people, and the working class generally does not have widespread support or very understand the need for the minimum wage struggle. And so he would like to ask how our comrades in US how do we try to explain and to organize the working class, especially amongst the migrant workers.
Can you hear me, Ty?
Yes.
Okay, good sound. A question about the presidential election, which begins it's next year, or I'm just trying to think. But the next
2016.
2016. I heard the possibility that Saunders, who's a kind of a independent member of the Congress, who's got a socialist label, he's not our kind of socialist, but he's more a kind of a Nordic social democratic type socialist with links to the Democratic Party. But I heard there's a possibility that he would stand as an independent in the presidential election. What would our attitude is the discussion about what with Sharma Sawant's incredible platform and victory, what we would be looking towards putting together for the presidential election in 2016. That's my question, and then I have a point on the minimum wage. You want to translate, Danny?
咁Vincent 條問題咧，就係關於即係美國2016年嘅總統大選啦。咁即係雖然仲有2年啦，但係據聞咧就有一個獨立嘅國會議員啦，咁佢就係比較傾向於北歐式嘅社民主義嘅。但係佢亦都係即係另一方面都係同民主黨咧有啲關係咁樣，但係咧佢就計劃咧喺2016年咧作為獨立嘅候選人咧參選即係總統。咁即係基於我哋即係Sharma Sawant啦，喺一個社會主義即係作為一個社會主義嘅選舉運動啦，有一個巨大嘅迴響同埋支持啦。咁我哋會唔會有計劃喺16年嘅總統選舉度咧對於呢個獨立候選人啦，或者係有啲乜嘢嘅計劃同埋策略咧？
And then just want to make the point on what an example the $15 now campaign is in terms of a minimum wage struggle, and what a lesson that would be for Hong Kong, where still the minimum wage in Hong Kong at $30 an hour is too low. It's not a living wage for a working family to live upon.
另外就係 Vincent 亦都想提到一點啦，就係即係我哋睇到即係美國同志$15嘅最低工資嘅運動啦，即係相對於香港一樣，我哋香港嘅最低工資咧，即係講緊30港元，係完全達唔到一個最低生活工資嘅一個標準嚟嘅。
And I think there's many lessons because here we have a situation where a workers' representative, a socialist, is elected to a legislator in Seattle and uses that as a platform, as a lever for then mobilizing grassroots workers and putting pressure on the union leaders, on the bureaucracy of the unions to conduct a struggle which otherwise they wouldn't conduct. Where everywhere, Hong Kong and in the US, the approach of the union leaders is towards compromise. They don't have confidence in struggle. They don't have confidence in the members of the unions. And I think that this is a lesson for Hong Kong.
見到我哋美國嘅Sharma Sawant嘅勝選啦，令到即係社會主義者可以利用即係議會嘅平台，利用到即係受到媒體輿論關注嘅平台咧，去大幅咁樣去加大對於群眾嘅動員基層草根嘅動員啦，去向啲工會領袖去施壓啊，向啲即係去組織更大關於$15嘅社會運動啦。喺香港相對而言咧，即係一樣。即係我哋嘅工會咧，亦都係非常之軟弱啦。工會領袖同美國一樣啦，都係即係冇信心去進行抗爭啊，或者冇信心能夠動員到佢啲成員嘅。咁所以呢個係對香港嘅工人運動亦都好大嘅學習嘅對象嚟嘅。
Because I think it's very impressive when you report that all of the major unions in the Seattle area are now supporting and endorsing the 15 Now campaign.
呢個頭先 派嘅報告亦都好有趣地去指出咗，即係依家西雅圖嘅各大工會啦，都已經係即係支持$15嘅呢個抗爭平台㗎啦。
And that we've taken steps to mobilise grassroots workers. We're setting up neighbourhood committees. In other words, we're trying to give democratic structures and establish a kind of mass grassroots base for this campaign, not just relying on building good links with the trade union tops.
而另一方面，我哋亦都係開始咗喺社區、喺地區咧建立一啲即係社區委員會啦，去喺地區度咧有建立民主嘅機構咁樣。咁即係代表住我哋唔係淨係即係嘗試係建立同工會領袖一啲友好嘅關係，反而係兩邊雙管齊下去做。
And I think that this initiative has come from the CWI comrades from Socialist Alternative and the elected representative Shama Sawan. It is a model really of how a socialist elected to the Hong Kong legislature could use that position to reach out to the wider working class and mobilise for struggle.
所以其實即係今次即係西雅圖我哋喺即係我哋社會主義替代嘅同志啦，同埋即係 Shama Sawan 嘅即係市議員啦，佢哋可以做到嘅工作咧，就可以作為我哋喺香港假設，如果我哋又可以有個社會主義嘅立法會議員咧入到立法會之後咧，可以做到嘅工作。
Now, the Hong Kong trade unions are numerically, and we could say economically, weaker than the US labour unions.
即係我哋可以話，即係香港嘅工會啦，比即係成員人口上邊啊，或者係資金資源方面啦，都係即係冇美國嘅工會咁強嘅。
And in some of the most low-paid sectors, trade union organisation is particularly weak.
尤其是係組織一啲人工低廉嘅工人嘅工會咧，佢哋嘅實力又更加係困難嘅。
But the examples that the US comrades have given is that a socialist elected to a parliament, to a legislature, to a city council, can use that position and partly can overcome some of the limitations, even where the trade union structures are weak.
但係喺西雅圖嘅即係社會主義者能夠勝選之後咧，其實亦都係證明咗一個能夠喺市會啊或者議會入邊勝選嘅一個社會主義者咧，係可以即係利用選舉即係議會嘅平台咧，去彌補翻咧工會運動不足嘅呢個缺陷嘅。
Now that's not in any way. This is not about trying to replace or bypass the unions. We need union organisation. This is decisive. But it is definitely a complement, an important political lever that can be used to overcome some of the problems of trade unionism, the limits of trade unionism.
我哋唔係話要取代工會運動，或者係要繞過工會自身，我哋仍然認為工會佢作為工人階級嘅組織係一個好關鍵嘅機構嚟嘅。但係我哋話一個社會主義者能夠去參選勝選進入議會，利用議會嘅平台咧，係可以輔助同埋支援即係工會運動自身嘅不足同埋困難嘅。
啱啱聽得最多都係有關即係美國入邊即係$15最低工資個 campaign。咁我想問，即係嚟緊未來喺美國仲有冇其他更加即係都係重要 campaign， 即係除咗$10最低工資
？This is a question. Right now, our main core issue is the $15 minimum wage in USA. But are there other main working class issues that we will be focusing now or in the future?
一個問題想問啦，美國實施佢話爭取$15嘅最低工資啦。咁如果如果真係俾佢成功實施得到嘅時候，資本家搬嚟西雅圖，甚至係搬嚟美國，咁令到大量工人失業，咁佢哋又會點樣處理咧？另外就係話 究竟再問翻一個再 basic 嘅問題，究竟幫助基層嘅人最低工資以外，係咪冇其他方法咧？譬如好似香港咁，實施咗最低工資之後，真係譬如好似大家樂咁，譬如早餐，以前20蚊樓下，我係真係可以食到一個似樣嘅早餐嘅，但係而家你冇30蚊，你係食唔到嘅。而係最重要就係話，嗰個苦主如果大幅度加嗰個令到通貨膨脹，因為最低工資而令到通貨膨脹，令到整個社會經濟處於一個停滯甚至下滑嘅情況，係咪爭取最低工資爭取到咁高，係咪對工人有益咧？到時僱主炒人請少啲人嘅時候嘅，係咪對於僱員嚟講又係一件好事咧？呢個我就係想鋪出嚟睇下佢哋點樣處理美國將 job 係譬如 transfer 去中國 transfer 去墨西哥，咁你係阻止唔到啲僱主做呢樣嘢嘅喎，係唯一只有喺 local 譬如清潔啊或者係呢類嘅工作先至可以真係訂立咗最低工資。如果唔係嘅話，甚至佢可以我同你訂立嗱，你開一間公司，我外判俾你，但係我外判俾你嘅時候嘅話，我只能夠用一個可能20蚊嘅時薪。咁呢啲佢哋根本就防止唔到嘅喎，所以佢哋咁樣爭取最低工資係咪一個最有效果嘅幫助工人嘅一個方法咧
？This is a question on how do we respond to our critics. For instance, if the capitalist decides that the $15 minimum wage is too high for their profits, so they decide to move their jobs away from Seattle or move away from USA. It may cause unemployment among the workers. How do we respond to this? Or and another critic is if there is the minimum wage, it would push up the inflation, meaning the working class would be facing an even higher living wage. So how do we face the problem? So there are different ways by the capitalists to get around with the minimum wage. For instance, by outsourcing their jobs to other places. So how do we respond to this so that the working class can really be benefited from the minimum wage?
好，咁一係就我哋而家答咗呢一輪嘅問題先，咁再之後如果仲有啲要補充或者討論咧，我哋可以再 come back.
So we can respond to this round of questions and then they can have follow-up comments.
Okay. Well, I'll begin. There's a big echo that didn't exist before. Is that easy to solve?
Might be at your end. He's saying there's a problem with the sound at his end.
Can you hear us? We're okay with it.
I can hear you. Okay, I'll move on.
Good.
The first comment raised that a new political party, a new workers' organization with representatives who live on the wage of the average workers is equally needed in Hong Kong as in the US.
咁頭先即係第一點就提到啦，即係一個突破主流政黨以外嘅工人階級政黨咧，係無論喺美國或者係香港咧，都係非常之需要嘅。
That the two main parties in Hong Kong, just like the two main parties in the US, are dominated by big business and pass anti-worker policies. Well, really, this is a global phenomenon that in most countries around the world, we see a crisis of working class representation everywhere.
咁無論係美國嘅兩大主要政黨或者香港嘅主流政黨咧，都係一樣咧，都係支持緊即係財團啊，同埋以財團同埋資本家利益為依歸嘅。呢個唔係淨係香港或者美國嘅事情，呢個其實全世界絕大部分嘅地區咧，一樣係出現緊呢個嘅現象嘅。咁即係代表住我哋喺全世界普遍嘅地方都係好缺乏工人階級獨立嘅政治代表。
And our international organization, the CWI, which has groups in over 40 countries around the world, in most countries, one of our central slogans, our central projects is to rebuild mass political parties that will represent working people and will fight on a clear working class and anti-capitalist and ideally a socialist program.
而我哋喺國際上面啦，工人國際委員會喺超過40個地區同埋國家咧有支部嘅。咁我哋喺各地嘅其中一個好核心嘅工作啦，就係要建立即係各地嘅工人階級嘅群眾政黨啦，係以工人階級嘅政治啦，甚至係社會主義嘅綱領咧，作為呢個工人政黨嘅綱領嘅。
Certainly, for us in the U.S., we want to continue building more electoral strength for our organization, Socialist Alternative. But more broadly, we're calling on the union leaders, on the social movement leaders, the immigrant rights, environmental groups, etc., to break from the Democratic Party and to form a new left mass workers' party that could challenge big business for power on a national scale, where our organization and other socialists would enter that party and argue for socialist policies within it.
咁我哋即係喺美國啦，就除咗話係想建立更大嘅選票嘅支持之外啦，更加重要嘅就係咧，我哋即係正在咧去進行說服同埋號召啦，其他嘅左翼組織啊、工會組織啊、或者係支持新移民嘅組織啊，支持環境保護嘅組織啊，共同咧去整合成為一個群眾性嘅左翼組織啦，去捍衛我哋每一個社會議題嘅。
The second speaker asked a question about how do we explain the idea of the minimum wage to workers, especially migrant workers. I think it's different in the U.S. and in Taiwan because here in the U.S. It's widely seen that it was the workers' movement who won the minimum wage.
咁第二條問題係關於即係究竟我哋點樣向啲工人階級去宣傳即係最低工資啊，或者係移工層面去宣傳最低工資嘅議題咧？咁即係有一點即係要去指出嘅就係即係當然美國同台灣之間咧係唔係完全一樣啦。即係例如話美國嘅狀況入邊咧，本身最低工資嘅爭取啦係好大程度就係嚟自於工人階級嘅傳統抗爭嘅傳統嘅。
And right now, especially, it's very popular amongst most working class people. In some ways, we were pushing on an open door when we raised the demand to raise the minimum wage.
即係佢本身喺工人階級層面咧已經有好大嘅關注同埋支持嘅。即係當我哋係進行呢個15蚊最低工資嘅運動嘅時候，基本上我哋好似已經係拱開一個本身已經打開嘅門嚟㗎啦。
In fact, in Minneapolis, it was amongst Latino immigrants from Mexico and Latin America, where this demand was most popular. We had a tremendous base of support for my election campaign in Minneapolis amongst Latino workers because overwhelmingly the jobs available for migrants are very low pay under very precarious, abusive conditions.
咁例如話喺明尼亞波利斯啦，即係泰摩參選嗰個城市啦，佢得到咗好大量嘅拉丁裔移民工咧嘅支持啦，因為通常喺呢啲咁嘅地方咧，即係留得俾拉丁裔嘅拉美裔嘅工人嘅人工咧，都係啲超低人工嘅工作嚟嘅。
The last question that was asked, I think, is an important one. How do we respond to our critics from big business who say raising the minimum wage will mean no investment, no jobs, price rises, etc.？
咁最後呢條問題咧亦都好重要啦，因為呢個係考驗我哋點樣回應，即係我哋即係攻擊得我哋最犀利嗰班人啦，點樣話即係佢哋會話即係增加最低工資，咪會趕走啲資本家咯，趕走啲投資咯，趕走啲即係趕走啲就業職位咯，或者會導致通脹咯。
On the one hand, some of this is just scare tactics and pure propaganda. Big business exaggerates the danger. For instance, there's very little evidence to prove that raising the minimum wage will increase prices. Mainly, it will come out of the profits of big business, and won't equal a simple increase in prices. That's bunk economics or incorrect economics.
咁其實首先好大嘅程度咧，呢啲都係嚟自於一啲恐嚇嘅宣傳啦，即係例如話佢哋即係實際上啦，往往呢啲咁嘅即係 好少嘅證據咧係證明咧係因為最低工資咧先係導致加價嘅。其實往往咧呢啲咁嘅加價都係嚟自即係去到即係為咗去填滿即係佢哋嘅利潤嘅。
On the other hand, most manufacturing jobs in Seattle and in the U.S., many anyway, already pay close to $15 an hour or higher. It's mostly low-wage service sector workers who are concentrated in the low-pay jobs.
再加上本身依家美國嘅好多嘅製造業嘅工人啊，或者技術工人咧，佢攞嘅人工咧已經係接近啊，或者係超過15蚊美金㗎啦。實際上15蚊美金所會影響嘅人咧，都係講緊啲好低廉嘅一啲厭惡性嘅，即係一啲即係超低人工嘅工種嚟嘅。
So many of these jobs, for example, in fast food or in retail, it would be very difficult for big business to outsource or take out of Seattle. That would cut into their profits more, and you have to buy a burger somewhere.
咁啊，例如話，即係講緊就話呢啲超低廉人工嘅工種就係啲服務性啊，例如話零售啊，或者係快餐業嘅工人啦。咁呢啲就係好難去所謂外判出去其他地方去做嘅工種嚟嘅，即係你冇可能喺即係你要去買個漢堡包，要走出即係你要走出西雅圖去買漢堡包㗎嘛。
Of course, in a general sense, on a capitalist basis, some of those arguments are true. If the entire U.S. raised the minimum wage to $15 an hour tomorrow, it's true that big sections of capital in the U.S. and internationally would try and move as many jobs as they could to lower wage economies like China.
咁當然冇錯，即係如果話美國聽日會全國地實現呢個15蚊最低工資啦，咁喺資本主義嘅市場邏輯底下，咁當然資本家會嘗試將佢哋最大即係盡可能地將佢哋可以移走嘅工種全部移走去啲更低廉人工嘅地方，例如話中國咁樣啦。
But we ask workers, if we accept this capitalist logic, where does it lead? It leads to an endless race to the bottom, where workers in the U.S. are competing with workers in China, in Mexico, in Europe, everywhere around the world for lower and lower pay, lower and lower regulations, lower and lower taxes, lower and lower environmental regulations. If we don't stand up and fight back against this capitalist logic, we're going to end up in an ever worse situation. We can't accept that.
咁所以更加重要就係我哋要去話俾同埋教育工人聽，即最大問題就係資本主義佢本身呢個邏輯啊嘛。如果我哋工人接受資本主義嘅邏輯嘅話，即係話美國嘅工人要同中國嘅工人、同東歐同南美嘅工人咧去鬥低人工，去鬥低呢個稅率，去鬥低呢個環境保護嘅標準，即係呢個係無了期嘅，即係大家鬥差嘅啫。即係咁樣落去，即係全世界嘅工人咧，只會係生活只係越嚟越差嘅啫。咁我哋能唔能夠接受呢個資本主義嘅呢種嘅邏輯咧
？The issue came up not in relation to the minimum wage, but in relation to Boeing, the manufacturer of airplanes, which the workers were asked to sign a contract that would gut their pensions and their pay. And at first they voted it down, but Boeing said if they didn't vote for this contract, they would move the entire factory to the south where there were no unions, where there are almost no unions, and everyone would lose their job. So the workers accepted on pain of, anyway, they accepted the contract with this blackmail.
咁其實唔係淨係講緊最低工資嘅議題，即係個資方先會進行呢種嘅抹黑宣傳嘅喎，或者威脅嘅喎。即係例如話喺即係西雅圖波音公司，即係之前咧就係威脅咧，即係要求啲員工咧去重新去訂立一個新嘅合約啦，去降低佢哋嘅退休金啊同退休保障啊等等。咁佢哋即係工人最初咧係反對呢個新嘅合約嘅。咁但係波音公司就話：如果你唔接受呢個新嘅合約咧，我咪索性將依家啲工作咧移去南部咯，嗰度即係有少啲工會啊，少啲工人運動啊。咁最後咧，工人咧就係即係因為呢個威脅咧，而係接受咗呢個更低嘅退休保障嘅。
But Shama Sawant, at a speech of the workers of Boeing, gave a call that won her national attention. She said, if Boeing is going to use this economic terrorism against the workers and threaten to move the jobs, that the workers should take over the factory and Washington State should publicly own the factory and run it in the interests of working people, not the interests of the bosses.
咁喺我哋311啦，就去到波音公司去聲援工人啦。咁佢嘅發言咧有一句好重要嘅一句咧，就係指出咗資方呢種咁嘅威脅咧，根本就係經濟恐怖分子嚟嘅。如果個老闆要咁樣去叫做去威脅同埋去挾持工人嘅話咧，咁工人咧亦都應該咧係可以將間波音公司咧去奪取咗佢，由呢個西雅圖嘅政府咧去國有化咗、公營化咗波音公司，由工人咧去直接管理呢間公司。
This is why socialist policies are so important to link to demands like raising the minimum wage, because in the end, the only long-term answer to the logic of capitalism, to the race to the bottom, is a preparedness to take the big corporations under public ownership and workers' democratic control.
所以亦都係解釋點解我哋唔係淨係支持15蚊最低工資，我哋係社會主義者嚟嘅。所以我哋認為即係最低工資嘅抗爭咧，佢唔係獨立嘅，唔係獨立存在，佢係準備緊工人階級嘅意識，能夠為未來咧由工人咧去全面接管呢個社會、呢個經濟去作出準備嘅。
Finally, I wanted to ask Somebody asked the question, what other issues other than 15 are we focused on? There are many, many issues. The fight against privatization of education is a key issue. The fight to unionize low-wage workers is a key issue. The fight of the undocumented immigrants is a major question in U.S. society right now. Attacks on women's rights are continue to increase. So our organization fights on all of these fronts and is prepared to wage struggle on all these fronts.
咁另外亦都係有提問到關於除咗15蚊最低工資之外，我哋仲有啲咩抗爭咧？例如話喺美國咧，亦都有好大反對私有化嘅抗爭啦，尤其是喺教育層面嘅私有化啦。亦都我哋有好多嘅運動啦，係組織緊低廉人工嘅工人咧去組織工會啦，同埋反抗啦，依家個政府啦去打擊女性權利嘅運動嘅。
Finally, Lawrence asked the question about Barry Sanders, who's the social democratic independent in the U.S. Senate, who's toyed with the idea of running for president as a left-wing independent. He calls himself a socialist.
咁最後咧，之前Vincent 就問一條問題啦，就係講緊呢個有喺美國嘅國會入邊咧有一個社會民主義嘅獨立嘅國會議員啦。咁佢自稱係一個社會主義者，咁佢亦都係咧拋出一啲概念咧，就話佢有興趣考慮咧去參選2016嘅總統選舉，作為一個獨立候選人嘅。
And what would our attitude be to Barry Sanders if he did run? The question, it depends. We don't think it's most likely he's going to run. But if he did run a serious campaign and champion the key issues he's championing are the fight against low economic inequality and low pay, for taxing the rich, for real action on the climate change crisis. If he really ran a serious, vigorous campaign championing these issues, even if his demands were only reformist, we would have to look seriously at supporting his campaign.
咁個問題就係關於我哋點樣對待呢個社會民主嘅議員去參選總統啦。咁個答案係仍然係要取決好多因素啦。呢個話要睇佢係咪真係。縱使我哋依家喺目前為止覺得佢未必真係會參選啦，就算佢而家去參選，我哋會睇佢係咪好認真地去倡議工人階級嘅啲議題啦。就算如果呢啲議題佢嘅立場係 即係仍然係一個比較改良主義嘅議題咧，我哋都要認真考慮咧，我哋會唔會去支持佢呢個嘅選舉嘅運動嘅？
We would, of course, raise our political differences with Barry Sanders and say that unless he was prepared to support a thoroughly socialist program, the idea of public ownership of the top corporations, the idea of democratic workers' control, that there is no lasting solution to the environmental crisis. There is no way to eradicate poverty or meet all the basic needs of working people. We raise these criticisms.
所以我哋但係同時我哋都會去提出我哋同佢之間嘅分別啦，即係立場上、政治上嘅分別，就係話，即係如果佢唔去提倡一個全面嘅社會主義制度嘅立場，即係話佢唔係提出一個民主嘅工人去管理我哋嘅社會啊、經濟啊、生產等等嘅話咧，咁佢所提出啲改良嘅政策啦，都唔會能夠長遠，都不能夠喺資本主義制度底下咧，獨立地去改善緊例如貧窮啊，或者改善呢個環境保護嘅問題嘅。
But on the other hand, if he ran a very vigorous campaign against the two parties of big business, in which he attempted to mobilize working people into campaign committees across the country, which is the only way he'd run a serious campaign. If he did that, it's possible that he could rouse tens of thousands into action against corporate politics and against the two-party system. And this would be a tremendously progressive development.
咁但係如果佢真係認真地去搞一個即係獨立嘅左傾嘅總統選舉運動嘅話咧，佢必定地咧係需要去動員緊，即係每個地區、每個社區嘅工人階級去加入到佢嘅即係競選嘅委員會入邊。咁呢個變相就代表住咧，佢哋會將即係全國嘅工人階級咧都動員起嚟。去加入呢個抗爭運動入邊，咁呢個將會係一個非常具進步性嘅一個行動嚟嘅。
It would force a debate in the trade unions, the environmental organizations, the immigrant rights organizations, all the organizations of working people and the oppressed in the U.S. about whether they should continue to support the Democrats or break with them. And this would help create the space for our idea of a mass workers' party to gain hold and win mass support in U.S. society.
因為如果佢咁樣去即係挑起咗工人階級，即係好大量地去動員起嚟嘅時候咧，就會令到無論係工會層面啊，或者係啲環境保護組織嘅層面啊，不同嘅層面啦嘅工人階級咧，都會去討論一個好重要嘅問題，就係究竟佢哋會唔會繼續去支持民主黨，定係佢哋要開始同民主黨割裂？咁啊變相咧係提供個更多嘅空間，俾好似我哋呢啲咁嘅我哋社會主義嘅概念咧，能夠喺一個獨立嘅空間咧去發展。
Okay, that's it for me.
係啦，咁啊第一輪嘅回應去到呢度。
咁因為佢嘅即係回應都俾我哋個預計嘅時間都比較長，咁而家都差唔多到12點。咁我哋即係而家就只可以有多一個問題咧，咁我哋就完結呢一度。咁如果大家都冇嘅話咧，咁我哋就可以就完咗呢 part 咧，咁我哋就即係會休息，係 lunch time 嚟。
So we will take one more question or comment before lunch. So.
我很好奇，就是这$15，就是这数字是怎么决定出来的？就是我觉得这是一个很具体的那个诉求，然后因为我们可能一般比较常听到的是我们想要提高工资，那就是这个$15，它当它更高或更低，是会有什么样的差别？就是它是怎么样去判断出这个數字？
佢嘅問題就係問$15呢一個水平係點樣制定出嚟嘅？因為$15係一個即係好 flexible 好具體嘅一個數字嘅訴求啦。咁樣佢想知道呢一個標準係點樣定出嚟咧，同埋佢想問如果即係高一啲或者低一啲嘅話，會有啲乜嘢嘅影響，唔同嘅影響。
So our main slogan is the $15 minimum wage. How did we come about this number? So how do we calculate that we need $15? If it's a bit higher or if it's a bit lower, what would be the differences?
而家就答下呢個問題就
Yeah, so you can respond to this, and if you have any other final comments. This is the last round.
Well, the way we came to that number was because when the fast food workers at McDonald's, at Burger King, at Wendy's, at all the fast food chains began going on strike last year, this was a slogan they adopted. They said theirs was a fight for 15 in a union. And that became very popular amongst activists and workers in the U.S.
咁首先即係話$15呢個咁嘅口號啦，呢個數字啦，其實唔係由佢哋去，即係唔係由我哋去作出嚟嘅。本身咧過去之前嗰一年間咧，已經有好多唔同嘅工人啦，例如話喺麥當勞嘅工人啊，喺 Burger King 嘅工人啊，唔同嘅快餐店嘅工人咧嘅罷工啊或者抗爭運動咧，已經係舉起咗$15嘅要求㗎啦。
Now, the calculations for what is a living wage, it's different in different parts of the U.S. Some cities like New York or Seattle, $15 an hour is barely a living wage for a single adult, whereas in other areas, maybe the living wage is a little bit less. And of course, if you have kids or family to support, 15 is not enough almost anywhere.
咁當然。即係話我哋話如果$15最低工資係以一個工人嘅即係生活工資嘅水平去計嘅話咧，咁即係全國美國咁大，唔同地區有唔同嘅生活費用㗎嘛。咁如果我哋講緊啲貴嘅城市嚟話，紐約啊、西雅圖啊，咁$15最低工資咧係僅足夠一個個人嘅生活費用嘅啫。咁即係話，如果係佢有屋企人。或者如果佢有細路要養嘅話咧，咁$15當然係唔夠嘅。
So of course we would actually support a higher wage for most workers. And when, for example, our members who are in unions at skilled jobs, we often fight for much higher wages than even 15. But the question is, what's the 15 idea, the 15 slogan has achieved a symbolic significance that can mobilize workers into action. It's seen as sort of the far end of what's realistic on the question of the minimum wage.
咁當然我哋即係喺如果係講一啲比較技術工種嘅工人嚟講，佢哋可能增加嘅，佢哋爭取嘅工資係更加高添。咁但係我哋話$15最低工資呢個係一個有具全國工人嘅象徵意義。咁呢個咁嘅訴求咧喺即係廣泛嘅工人階級層面入邊咧，都覺得係一個合理同埋可行嘅即係具現實意義嘅一個爭取嘅水平，亦都係可以吸引到好大量嘅工人階級嘅支持嘅。
We've had some sectarian, small socialist groups on the left to have criticized us, saying that we're supporting a reformist call because we call for 15, and shouldn't we? Why are we only asking for crumbs when we should be asking for the whole entire bakery?
即係有啲其他嘅一啲即係更加宗派主義嘅組織啦，啲細小嘅左翼組織會攻擊我哋啦，話哇你哋原來你哋係改良派嚟嘅咋，即係淨係你攞$15最低工資，根本係好似麵包稅咁樣，點解我哋唔要成間麵包鋪攞翻嚟咧？
But this fundamentally misunderstands the method of Marxism, which our organization bases itself on. The method of raising transitional demands of how to win people to the ideas of socialism and our bigger programmatic demands.
咁但係呢個只係證明咗佢哋唔明白馬克思主義入邊嘅過渡綱領嘅一個策略，就話我哋點樣可以現實地去贏取工人階級對於社會主義概念嘅支持。
When the CEO of Target, one of the biggest corporations in Minneapolis, makes $13,000 an hour, some, of course, would see it quite, many of the more radicalized workers would see it very reasonable to demand $30 an hour at least, right?
即係當我哋例如話喺明尼亞波利斯一個間財團嘅老闆嘅 CEO 係攞緊$13,000一個鐘嘅時候，咁可能比較激進嘅工人話：你攞$13,000一個鐘，我攞30蚊個鐘都唔合理啫，係嘛？
But we have to take into account what is the consciousness of the working class. What will they be prepared to struggle for? I mean, we could run our election campaign simply saying, socialism tomorrow, abolish the bosses, etc. And many people would give us a thumbs up, actually, but they wouldn't see that as a realistic fighting demand that they could take ownership of and build in their communities and workplaces. So it's our obligation to arm the working class with immediate fighting demands that can be seen as realistic, that can win mass support, and through the course of the struggle itself, workers will radicalize and become aware of their own power. And out of that process, we can raise ever more higher demands against capitalism and to meet the needs of all workers in the environment.
因為我哋要考慮嘅就係工人階級本身佢哋自己嘅意識又去到邊度，佢哋嘅組織嘅力量又有幾大？即係我哋可以搞一個運動，就係話我哋要立即實現社會主義，立即去取締所有嘅私有產權咁樣。咁但係即係可能好多工人啊，或者好多人都會去拍膊頭話我支持你，但係工人階級整體上會覺得呢個唔會係一個可行，唔會一個即係佢哋可以見到嘅範圍內實現到嘅目標嚟㗎嘛，咁佢哋唔會走出嚟支持㗎嘛。但係我哋喺攞呢個15蚊最低工資嘅議題上邊，我哋就能夠鼓動到大量嘅工人去參與，即係去動員出嚟呢個抗爭上邊，而動員咗咁大部分咁廣泛嘅工人階級出嚟去支持、去參與個鬥爭嘅時候，我哋就能夠去討論、去教育。喺呢個過程入邊咧，工人階級咧嘅意識就會提升，並且會激進化，並且咧能夠去提出更進取同埋更完整嘅抗爭，去反對整個資本主義嘅。
So I'll just end with this, comrades. In the U.S., our organization has just moved from being a very small, marginal force in U.S. society to becoming a prominent force, and in Seattle, leading a mass struggle.
咁最後同大家同志講翻啦，即係我哋喺美國嘅支部啦。剛剛從一個好小型嘅左翼嘅組織啦，發展到一個好具影響力嘅組織嚟嘅。
Across the country，
領導緊群眾運動嘅組織嘅。而呢個亦都係講緊全國性嘅。
Across the country, we're getting applications on our website to join our organization in the hundreds, more than we've ever had before, which indicates the huge openness to socialist ideas.
而我哋喺全國亦都係收集到數以嘅人咧去申請加入我哋社會主義替代。咁呢個代表住咧，即係我哋係開闢咗一個個新嘅領域，有好多人對於社會主義嘅概念啦，同埋運動係好感興趣同埋想參與嘅。
And I think what's happening in the U.S. is not unique. Actually, on a global scale, we're seeing from 2011 to this year, to what's happening in the Ukraine, to Bosnia this week, what happened in across the world, we're seeing a generalized rising up of working people, of a demand for some kind of political alternative to this broken capitalist system.
而呢個現象亦都唔係淨係喺美國出現嘅，喺全世界，即係去到最近，我哋都見到又有新，即係喺唔同嘅地方，亦有新嘅群眾運動啦，例如喺烏克蘭或者係波斯尼亞，都有好多新嘅群眾咧係企出嚟咧，想尋求喺資本主義以外咧係有新嘅運動同埋選擇嘅。
And I think if we can continue to win victories for socialism in the U.S., this can have a big impact around the world. And I think we are entering a period internationally where socialist ideas will once again be on the rise, where once again we can win millions of working class people to the idea that a socialist alternative to this broken capitalist system is possible. So thank you so much for inviting me to this discussion.
而我哋相信，即係我哋喺美國嘅社會主義運動啦，會有更迅速嘅發展啦，而亦都係會影響住即係世界各地嘅工人啦，同埋群眾啦，會對於即係今日啦腐敗嘅資本主義啦，有更大嘅反抗同埋對於社會主義嘅概念咧，將係重新地咧去得到更廣泛嘅工人階級嘅支持。
Solidarity, comrades.
咁同各位同志去團結聲援啦。
咁我哋 哋呢一 part 就去到呢一度，咁我哋就完結咗。咁我哋然之後下晝就2點鐘咧再翻嚟咧，咁就會有呢一個駕駛學院嘅工會嘅創辦人啦，同埋碼頭罷工嘅工人咧，都會喺呢度同我哋去討論關於香港嘅工人抗爭。希望大家就2點鐘可以準時翻到呢度。咁如果大家去食飯嘅話咧，就建議大家去城大嘅劇。